It's the 30th of May, 2015, and this is episode 217. This show is intended for informational and educational purposes only. What cryptocurrency enables is new, empowering, and exciting, but we're not experts, just obsessed companions walking the road towards a more peer-to-peer future. On today's episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin, we're talking the block size limit. First, we're joined by Gavin and Andresen to explain the historical context and what he's proposing. Then after the break, we're joined by Peter Todd, who gives us another angle on the story. This is an important one. Let's get into it. So one of the big issues that's been getting a lot of attention recently, not just recently, for a while now, but it's kind of come to a head recently, is the issue of the block size in the Bitcoin blockchain. Under nominal circumstances, we expect to see maximum of 1 megabyte worth of block every 10 minutes, and so that means that there's a load of about 6 megabytes to keep up with the blockchain and to download it as time goes on. The problem is that this kind of limits how far Bitcoin can grow, and the often talked about 7 transactions per second limit is actually a function of that block size. Today we're here with all the hosts of Let's Talk Bitcoin, Andreas, Stephanie, and I, and we're also joined by Gavin Andresen. I don't actually know what to call you anymore. Are you the chief scientist still?
I am still chief scientist of the Bitcoin Foundation. I also have some title at MIT, but I'd have to dig out my job offer to find out what my official MIT title is. They're paying my salary these days.
Fair enough. So what do you consider your job at this point, regardless of who it is that's paying you?
I see my job as kind of doing what I've been doing for the last 4 years, which is trying to make the Bitcoin project a success. I'm focused on the technology. I don't really care about politics. I want the technology to work and keep on working, be as successful as possible. That's what I see as my job.
It might be useful if we do a bit of a historical here to talk about how this block size limit came into place in the first place, because it wasn't there from the beginning. And I think that's a really important part of this story, which is why it was put in place and under what conditions it was put in place. Tell us a bit about the history of how the block size limit came into being in the first place. The original client, from what I know, didn't have a limit, or if it did, it had a 32 megabyte limit or something like that. Can you tell us more about the history of this limit, Gavin?
So in the beginning, the very first versions of Bitcoin really didn't have a block size limit. There was a practical limit, and there was a 32 megabyte limit on the size of a network message. And so blocks had to fit into that network limit. But in the consensus code, in the code that, checked blocks to see if they were correct, very first versions of Bitcoin up to, I'd have to go back and check what version, probably 0.3 point something, had no limit on the size of blocks. And if you read Satoshi's writings, his vision was that there would be no limit to blocks. Blocks would be as big as they needed to be. Now, after the first flash dotting, Bitcoin got a whole lot of attention, really started to get the attention of smart people who had the technical chops to look at it and try to break it. And we had a bunch of breaks that happened shortly after there. And so there were a bunch of 0.3 releases that happened fairly rapidly as people found problems with the first versions of Bitcoin. And this is where a couple of the famous early bugs happened. So Satoshi made a bunch of changes pretty quickly. I think he didn't think them through all that carefully. So he did things like disabled a bunch of opcodes. He set a limit on the block size to 1 megabyte that prevents some attacks that you could mount, and did a bunch of other things to kind of shut the door on attacks that people were telling him about privately. Some of those I was privy to. Some of those he kind of bounced ideas off of me on, we have this problem, how do we fix it? And how do we fix it quickly? Because at that point, Bitcoin was being used. And that's how the 1 megabyte block size limit came into being. Satoshi was very clear that that limit would be raised if transaction volume got high enough that it needed to be raised, and even described how it would be raised.
Gavin, just to clarify, what exactly kind of attack would a block size limit of 1 megabyte stop?
The attack that's the most worrying is that you produce a block that's, let's say, 40 megabytes big that takes everybody 15 minutes to validate. You create a very expensive to validate block. and you release that on the network, and then everybody gets busy for 15 minutes trying to validate that block. In the meantime, the attacker could be working on the next block, and assuming they had enough hashing power, they might find another block that took 15 minutes to validate. And since the block time is 10 minutes, it can take a block that takes longer than that to validate, then you can kind of destroy the network, essentially. You can just have everybody doing busy work of validating blocks in the past while you continue to create very expensive to validate blocks and kind of flooding the network and causing everything to come to a grinding halt. So that's the attack that Satoshi was trying to prevent with the 1 megabyte block size limit.
So that's one end of the bookend of history, if you like, the beginning, the reason this limit was put in place. Now, if we look forward and peer into the future, you're foreseeing, and I think Mike Hearn also validated this with one of his own postings, that because of the cyclical nature of Bitcoin transaction volume, we're going to have a peak at the end of this year in the winter, and then a bit of a lull in the summer. It's a cyclical yearly peak and lull cycle. And then at some point in 2016, when the next peak comes around, if you extrapolate the transaction volume, we will be hitting some limits. The other thing that's lending urgency to this argument is your projection that we're going to run into capacity limits sometime in the winter of 2016. Can you describe what that looks like from your perspective?
Yeah, so if you extrapolate kind of transaction volume trends and block size trends, then yeah, we are headed for that 1 megabyte limit sometime in the next, 6 to 12 to 18 months. Mike had a blog post describing what he thought would happen. I think things won't actually be as dire as he portrayed. He's imagining that, memory pools for full nodes will fill up and nodes will start to crash just because there will be this huge ever increasing volume of transactions that will never get confirmed and will just gum up the whole network. I don't think things will get that bad. I think people will actually just stop sending transactions if they notice that their transactions are not getting confirmed in, a day or 2 or 3 or a week. And the nature of transaction confirmation and the nature of kind of how blocks are found kind of softens that a little bit. So every once in a while, we'll get a period of time where transactions really pile up because blocks are found more slowly than normal. And every once in a while, we'll have a period of time where lots of transactions get confirmed because we're finding lots of blocks. It's just the nature of the randomness of mining that we get this kind of natural variation in, how many transactions are confirmed in any given period of time. And so I think that natural variation plus, people react. So if you're sending transactions with very low fees that aren't getting confirmed, well, then you'll bump up your fees if you can. And if you can't bump up your fees because transactions get more expensive, then you find some alternative. And that alternative may be just, well, I won't use Bitcoin. I'll find some other way of doing what I want to do. So it won't be, I don't think we'll have a hard crash. I don't think, it will be disaster. I think what we will see is people turning away from Bitcoin and using other things. And I think we'll see transaction fees rising. Both of those things, I think, are bad. I would rather avoid both of those things because I think I want to see as many people using Bitcoin as possible, and I want to see transaction fees to be as low as possible.
So to forestall this outcome that you think will be damaging, perhaps not disastrous, but nevertheless will lead to some negative consequences around Bitcoin, what you're saying is that a change like this, increasing the block size limit, requires more than a year in planning in order to execute, which means that we're already running out of time. We have to start planning now in order to hope to get a hard fork or non-backwards compatible change like this into the blockchain before the winter of 2016. Is that it?
Yeah, that's right. If we could roll this out, this kind of change out to increase capacity in 2 months, then I wouldn't be nearly as worried. But it really does take, at least 6 months, probably a year to roll this kind of change out. You have to give people a lot of time to plan ahead so that they can upgrade their miners, their mining pool software, whatever software is required, all of that needs time to upgrade. And previous experience has shown that it takes on the order of months to, a year to do that. And that's why I am pushing this so hard right now.
There seems to be an issue here, which is that inaction in itself is a choice. Meaning if we don't do anything, that means we're accepting a block size limit turning into a potential capacity issue. So inaction in itself is a choice. What are the other alternatives? Some people propose various other solutions or optimizations to solve this, from the Lightning Network, which is a payment channel solution for aggregating many transactions into one transaction, or various other optimizations involving perhaps sidechains, invertible bloom tables, incentivized nodes, replaced by fee, child pays for parent. We've discussed a lot of these things on the show, actually. Are there other options that we should be considering? If so, what are the options at the moment?
So there are lots of potential ways. And a lot of these ways actually are already happening. If you talk to big transaction creators, they are already doing things to keep transactions off the blockchain. So, a lot of Coinbase transactions, if you're paying a Coinbase merchant from a Coinbase wallet, that transaction never hits the blockchain. It's just Coinbase making some entries in their database. I know that some of the big processors are also talking to each other so that they can, if a Coinbase merchant accepts payment from a hosted wallet, maybe they'll settle that off chain also, so that, they don't have to create a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain. These types of things have been happening and will continue to happen, and will happen no matter what we do with the block size, because, if you can save a half a penny in transaction fees, maybe it's worthwhile for you to save a half a penny. A lot of those solutions I'm not crazy about, because they get away from the decentralized nature of Bitcoin and the notion that you can be in control of your own money. Some of the really interesting ones that kind of maintain that decentralization, like the Lightning Network proposal, I think are great ideas, and I think they should happen. But whenever I'm looking at an engineering problem, I don't like to pick winners and losers. It's better to try 3 or 4 different things in case 2 or 3 of them don't work. I think we should increase the block size, and I think we should have the Lightning Network, and I think we should have lots of innovative solutions for getting transactions off the blockchain. I don't think it's an either or. I mean, certainly we're seeing lots of companies that are very interested in quick transactions. So I think we'll see a lot of innovation pushed just to get, very quick transactions happening, no matter what happens, right? And increasing the block size doesn't help. We still have the 10-minute confirmation time. So if you're interested in having transactions that settle in half a second or a tenth of a second or even quicker, then you're going to need some other solution in any case.
Well, this sounds like a very sober and pragmatic engineering discussion. Lots of pros and cons and rational decision making. But if you go online and read some of these discussions, you see that this cuts to the heart of what people think Bitcoin is or what people think Bitcoin should be. And as a result, instead of it being an engineering discussion, really it's a discussion about first principles, which quickly becomes a discussion about projected ideologies. To some, what you're proposing is nothing less than the destruction of Bitcoin's gold standard and the removal of scarcity, that in order to make it the currency of every cup of coffee will destroy its unique principles. To others, not doing anything will again destroy Bitcoin. So you get all of these very, very strong opinions on both sides. What do you see Bitcoin is supposed to be? In your opinion, does this change what Bitcoin is or should be, or is it just about engineering?
For me, it's just about engineering. I try to stay very neutral about what Bitcoin is supposed to be. There's some people who think Bitcoin should be a digital gold, great inflation-proof store of value, and it doesn't really matter how many transactions can be done, right? As a store of value, primary thing is just keep it stable. Don't do anything that could rock the boat. So I think we see some people in that camp who are very against any change to Bitcoin. Other people see Bitcoin as a currency and want to see it used day-to-day transactions. They tend to support increasing transaction volume. And there's this whole new group of people who see Bitcoin as this global public ledger, where they want to do other things with the blockchain, leverage the security built into this global public ledger to do new applications with it, like title registries for property in foreign countries or whatever. And they also tend to support increasing the block size just because they think more cheaper transactions will be better for those kinds of applications. I think everybody who's using Bitcoin should be able to use it. And the more people who use it, the better, the more value it has. So really, I look at what can we do to help increase adoption, to make it more attractive for more applications. I don't really care what those applications are. My job...
But Gavin, ultimately it does become sort of a political issue because any hard fork is going to have to be adopted by, half of the miners or a majority. That kind of democratic aspect, I guess, is going to come into play at some point.
Sure.
If a change is going to be made.
Yes, that's true. It's not just half the miners, right? It has to be all the big exchanges, all the big merchant processors, all the big merchants. They have to buy in also because, if half the miners produce some Bitcoins, that you can't exchange at any of the exchanges and you can't, buy anything at any of the online merchants, then those Bitcoins are worthless. So it really does have to be everybody. It has to be merchants, miners, end users' wallets, which actually in this case doesn't really matter. The wallets that most people are using today don't care what the block size is, which is kind of nice. But, the big merchants, the big miners, they will all have to agree that this is a good idea and that they will go for it, or at least a vast supermajority have to agree. Once you get 60, 70, 80% of those merchants and miners agreeing that this is a good idea, then all the rest will be dragged along. There's no value in being the, small minority that gets left behind if you don't go along with a change.
From a theoretical perspective, if you look at the choice that miners or merchants or exchanges are facing, an increase in the block size limit will certainly increase some costs, some operating costs. It will require more RAM, more bandwidth, more hard disk space. But that, at the same time, pales in comparison to the magnitude of the block reward or the economy riding on top of most of these technologies that merchants and exchanges are involved in. So really the big decision is to make sure that whatever choice you make, you are with the herd, with consensus, because falling out of consensus is a much higher cost than anything that would be imposed either by staying on a smaller block. So small blockism, large blockism, really doesn't matter. The main decision facing most of these participants from an economic perspective is staying on the right side of consensus, whatever that may be, because the cost of not being on the side of consensus is far higher than any of the other costs.
Yeah, the hardware costs, right? So I'm proposing 20 megabyte blocks right now. The costs to support even, completely, utterly full 20 megabyte blocks is really modest, right? It's on the order of $20 or $30 a month, bandwidth and CPU, which is almost nothing to run a full node. If you're a merchant or miner, you really should be able to afford $20, $30 a month. The real costs will be the human costs of actually, downloading new code, installing it, and running it on your server, right? That's going to cost probably orders of magnitude more to hire somebody who knows what they're doing to do that safely. That would argue against any change, and I think that is partly why there is opposition to any change, is just any change requires cost, although Bitcoin is still the point in its life where we're still finding security issues. So you will see Bitcoin releases that don't change anything except for fix some denial of service attack or fix some other problem. Anybody serious about Bitcoin should be prepared to upgrade their software because there are still denial of service attacks, various other problems that we find and fix. I'm not super sympathetic to people who don't want to change just because they're not willing to change anything.
Just following up on your proposal for 20 megabyte blocks, why 20 megabytes? Is there a reason why that's preferable to doing a dynamically adjusting system like miner difficulty?
Yeah, so I picked 20 megabytes just because I did a back of the envelope calculation on kind of what can a typical person with a pretty good internet connection do today. So if you do the math, if you have a typical pretty good internet connection, you probably have on the order of a 300 gigabyte per month bandwidth cap. And it turns out 20 megabyte blocks that would be chock full would be about 170 gigabytes per month. And so that's well under that 300 gigabyte cap. Gives kind of headroom for overhead, and you probably want to stream a few movies during the month while you're running a full node. So that's where I got that number. Why not some sort of dynamic limit? I'm not opposed at all to having some sort of dynamic limit under that. The reason I'm proposing an upper limit hard cap is because there are a lot of people who don't want to give miners complete control over how big blocks are. So any algorithm that you come up with that uses some sort of dynamic limit based on how big blocks have been in the past can be gamed by the miners. So miners can stuff blocks full of transactions that are basically pay the miners themselves and make them as large or as small as they want them to be. And so I'm not opposed at all to having some dynamic algorithm underneath that to make the people happy who are worried about kind of miners taking over and miners making it impossible for people to run full nodes at home. So that's why I'm proposing the hard cap at 20 megabytes.
Gavin, in the beginning, Bitcoin was the currency where everybody could verify every transaction. Everybody could participate in mining from their laptop. Everybody could run a full node. Today, not everyone can participate in mining. It's very expensive, complex to do so. Still, almost everyone can run a full node, but that may not be the case for much longer. And still, almost everyone can run a full node that validates every transaction, but that comes at the cost of not being able to support all of the cups of coffee in the world. In the future, do you see those principles as being incompatible? Can we have a currency that is everybody's cup of coffee, where an average user can validate every transaction in the world on their desktop and maintain a full node? Or are those just fundamentally incompatible? And if they're incompatible, which one are you choosing with this?
I'm a technological optimist. I'm older than I look. So I've been around since, I guess I got my first computer in about 1982. So I remember computers when a Commodore 64 with 64K of memory was really awesome. And I've seen the progression of technology march forward, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. If you extrapolate the bandwidth trends and CPU trends and storage trends another 10 or 20 years, then in 20 or 20 years, the average home computer should be able to process every single cup of coffee transaction that happens in the world. And I say this and people think I'm crazy. People say, no, there's no possible way. And then they go out and they buy, a couple 1 terabyte hard disks to store every single episode of their favorite TV show, which was just a crazy idea even 5 or 10 years ago. So I do think that we will get to a point where an ordinary person running a typical personal computer at home on a typical pretty good internet connection in 10 or 20 years will be able to process basically a transaction volume that is just kind of unimaginable today. I could be wrong. I mean, maybe things will stop suddenly, but I don't see any evidence of that. And I think that's what we should aim at.
This episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin is brought to you by Shapeshift.io. With no account or sign-up required, it's the easiest way to buy or sell Bitcoin, Litecoin, Dogecoin, BitShares, Ripples, and over 17 other leading cryptocurrencies. If you run a business and want to be able to accept more than just Bitcoin without building the infrastructure to maintain all those wallets, check out the Shapeshift API. If you're a multi-crypto individual who longs to spend their NXT everywhere that Bitcoin is accepted, you're in luck with the Shapeshift Lens browser extension. If your worldview of crypto goes beyond Bitcoin, Do yourself a favor and check out shapeshift.io to instantly convert altcoins and to discover the future of cryptocurrency exchanges. The magic word for episode 217 is limit. That's L-I-M-I-T. Limit. You've got until about 10 a.m. Pacific time on Saturday the 6th of June to visit letstalkbitcoin.com or the Let's Talk Bitcoin iOS app to enter it for your share of the listener rewards. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the show.
Joining us in the discussion over block size limits, we have Peter Todd, who is a very well-known developer who has contributed many things to the Bitcoin core software and is well-known also for being very outspoken about his opinions on blockchain technology. So delighted to have you on the show, Peter, to help us understand this issue a bit better.
Thanks for inviting me.
We've been talking with Gavin for the last 30 minutes about the block size limits, and we talked a bit about the history of how it came into place and what the concern is about the future. So why don't we just dive right in? What do you think should be done, if anything, about block size limits?
Like most people in the space, I recognize that the underlying blockchain technology that Bitcoin uses inherently has scaling limitations. If you want to go keep the current security model where people do not trust other people to validate for them, you have the majority of users validating the blockchain themselves. You have to go have a system where everyone goes and validates everyone else's transactions, and in computer science terms, it's known as O(n) squared scaling, which is usually considered to be pretty bad. And at some point, the system will break as you increase the number of transactions. And that's just kind of a fundamental limitation of the system. The second issue is the issue of control, which is, again, we want to have a system where a very large number of people can participate in it in terms of what transactions get into the blockchain. And you have the exact same issue all over again. With the current Bitcoin architecture, to participate in mining, you have to have the entire blockchain. Now, you can go and participate in hashing, that is selling your hashing power to someone who actually does the real mining, but, not having the blockchain at all. But if you want to fully participate, you have to have the full blockchain. So that's kind of the underlying issue. And, on top of that, you get issues where we know that, we have to go and create a system that even people on quite low bandwidth connections, potentially high latency connections, can participate in. Your examples are Tor, other anonymity technology. We have the issue that we know regulators are looking at, and of course, they're already looking at ways of applying regulations to the gateways, if you will, of people who buy and sell Bitcoins. But the next step beyond that is to start applying regulations to Bitcoin nodes, Bitcoin miners themselves. And that's something that keeps on getting brought up a lot in the conferences I go to, and it's a very active topic of discussion in how they will go implement these regulations. And needless to say, I think most of us don't really agree with that view and would rather have a system that remains free and open to all, but that's the challenge you have.
Does the system as it stands now actually support the type of model that you're talking about? Because in theory, it seems like, yes, absolutely, it'd be great if everybody was mining and not hashing, but I think that most of the people who consider themselves to be miners at this point are in fact just hashing. So does this actually impact that?
Well, what's interesting, I think, about the current model is it is certainly a compromise. But, it's always interesting to go think, all right, what would happen if the Ben Loskys of the world decided, say, all right, as of 1 month from now, we've got this new blacklist of stolen Bitcoin addresses, and if you are a Bitcoin miner, you must prevent transactions from happening that involve those addresses. It'd be a simple way to go freeze funds. Even though mining pools and solo miners and so on are relatively centralized, there's a relatively small number of them. The moment they tried to do that, you would immediately get new mining operations popping up. And you would get these operations popping up in much more censorship resistant, much more regulatory resistant places, like the so-called dark web and so on. And the end result would be not much actually changes. Again, talking to regulators at these conferences, I mean, this is kind of one of the things you go talk about. Say, well, you realize if you did try to do what you want to do to regulate the fundamental Bitcoin blockchain, this is the ultimate result that would happen. And you might as well not try. That doesn't necessarily make them happy, but I think it gives a very good security margin for the system as a whole. Equally, the fact that, so many users, even if they don't already validate the blockchain themselves, but are in a position where they easily could, simply by installing some software and waiting a day or two for the blockchain to download. This is a very, very protective thing. In that, again, if anyone on, say, the mining side tried to, say, change the rules, tried to, say, create money out of thin air, change the inflation rate, and so on, I think you would very quickly see a rapid increase in the number of people using full nodes, and the efforts would fail. Whereas if you're in a situation where that's not so easy to do, it's much less clear that such efforts could be prevented.
This discussion is primarily about a change in the code of consensus, and at the same time, it also seems to attract a lot of debate about principles and ideology as to what Bitcoin is and what Bitcoin should be in the future. Do you see this primarily as an engineering debate, or is this really a fundamental choice that will affect what Bitcoin can be in the future and the ideologies involved in many of the participants in this debate?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, although I would say it's primarily an ideological debate. Now, the engineering side of it, in sort of the short and medium term, certainly can go show that some block sizes work under certain assumptions. As an example, for instance, if we had, say, a 20 megabyte block size right now, I can't get into too many details, but long story short is, there's certain security implications to it that would quite directly affect the Bitcoin network. These are sort of technical limitations. Whereas I think the bigger issue is, how do we scale Bitcoin up? Because it's obvious you can go scale Bitcoin up by just increasing the block size in response to demand. This is a very easy thing to do, but it very directly impacts the decentralization of the system. As an example, I spend a lot of my time actually talking to banks and so on about blockchain type systems. And, they're very interested in this stuff. You can easily show them how, with appropriate modifications to basic Bitcoin protocol, you could have a system that scales up indefinitely. But you just have to go pick some people to go trust. And as it scales up bigger and bigger, the harder and harder it is to create a system that is not run by just a couple computers. Equally, the other issue is in a decentralized system where there's no rules for who can or cannot access it other than access to money. It's very difficult for us to go and say what is or isn't permitted on the Bitcoin blockchain. And when you have this wonderful append-only ledger that is immutable once written, that's a really, really useful construct for stuff far beyond just money. Unfortunately, that also means that we potentially have demand for the blockchain that goes far beyond necessarily the Bitcoin community right now. And there's no clear way to limit access. If we have, say, organizations like NASDAQ running trading platforms that link back to the Bitcoin blockchain, they can go outbid us for transaction space. And there's not much we can do about that. There's not much we can do for capacity planning. Again, this kind of becomes a very philosophical debate about how we want to deal with this challenge. How do we have the governance to go make these decisions? And they're not going to be easy decisions. For instance, we say went to 20 megabytes. It's trivial to imagine demand for the blockchain increasing 20 times over. That's a tiny, tiny change. If we're at 20 megabytes, then do we go to 40? Do we go to 80? There's just no clear answer to this.
I'm not understanding necessarily the problem that you're seeing, because it sounded to me like you were saying the problem is that there is a lot of demand and only finite space. So it doesn't matter if we increase the amount of space because it's futile anyways. Isn't increasing the space the solution to the problem that you were describing with NASDAQ, outbidding people for space?
Well, the problem is that directly impacts what Bitcoin is good for, precisely because it makes it more centralized. As an example, And this has actually come up in some of the discussion among the core developers of Bitcoin Core. As an example, Luke Jr. and Gregory Maxwell brought up the fact that with an increase, say 20 megabytes, they personally would not be able to have full nodes at their residences because they just don't have access to internet connections fast enough. So right there, you're making a political decision to prevent people from being able to participate fully in Bitcoin in exchange for decreasing transaction fees. And given that you're in a situation where you can't really, say, predict demand easily, you can't predict who's going to be using the blockchain, I think this becomes a very, very difficult decision. And it's not like something we have a governance model for instance.
Governance is a big issue here. I think because there's a couple of interesting forces playing out. One is that as the constituencies that comprise consensus, the miners, merchants, exchanges, web-based wallets, wallet software, and all of these different competing constituencies grow, it gets harder and harder to get broad-based consensus, especially on something that's controversial, which would indicate that, if anything, it's going to get more and more difficult to make major changes to this protocol over time, if that's even desired. On the other hand, however, if there's no consensus decision-making, that in itself is a decision. It's a decision to remain with the status quo, a conservative decision to keep what's in the protocol now and not change it. Where do you see the future of making these big consensus decisions going?
Yeah, and I'll also go point out that there is a very broad space of things you can do with Bitcoin that do not require consensus. There's a huge space of ways to use it. And I think we've seen this in terms of, say, hub and spoke payment channels, the Lightning Network, the various off-chain transaction systems that people use. These are all solutions that do not require consensus to implement. These are things that kind of can naturally grow out in response to market demand, and we've seen this happen. We've already bumped up against the block size limit multiple times before, and the market has responded by changing the way we use Bitcoin and moving low-value transactions off of the Bitcoin blockchain. This has kind of been a natural process influenced by the supply and demand bidding system for blockchains that's been implemented for years now.
Not making a decision will lead to predictable capacity constraints occurring more and more often as soon as perhaps mid-2016. How do you see that scenario playing out? If we do reach and start producing full blocks on a fairly regular basis, on the one hand, this is seen as a potential problem for capacity planning and transaction fees, but I believe you've said that this will encourage market-based responses and solutions. So how do you see this capacity playing out?
Well, like I say, we have seen this happen before. With, for instance, as Satoshi got more and more popular, it did reach, essentially full capacity. If not for the fact that people were outbidding Satoshi Dice users, some wallets wouldn't have been able to get transactions mined in a timely fashion, with their default fees. And as the price of Bitcoin went up, real value in terms of US dollars, fiat currency of fees went up. And you saw systems like Satoshi Dice and, other gambling sites go change the way they worked to go and move transactions off the blockchain. Similarly, ChangeTip is a great example of this, where tipping sites that were previously doing their transactions entirely on blockchain, they got priced out of the market and moved to systems that were off blockchain. And when you're sending someone, say, a 5-cent tip, paying a 1 cent fee on top of that doesn't make much sense. Whereas equally, the security implication of trusting $25 to some third party, which you might go use over a few months, is not a big deal either. So the market responded in the logical, cost-effective way, which was to just move things to ChangeTip and call it a day. We're going to see more and more of that. And equally, when you look at things like hub and spoke payment channels, again, this can replace hundreds, thousands, depending on the application, of transactions with singular transactions. There was just the announcement of Streamium.io, pay per minute video. And again, the underlying architecture uses payment channels to replace many, many transactions with one.
So, Peter, are you basically saying that this is a problem that's going to take care of itself through market mechanisms, and maybe there's not actually one solution, but the market's just going to respond to fill the gaps where they're needed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's going to be the solution that we see for quite a long time. I, like many other people, think that eventually, potentially many years down the road, there may become broad consensus to do a block size limit increase. But right now, we just don't have that consensus. And this is a view that's shared widely.
So you think nothing actually needs to change with the actual Bitcoin protocol right now?
Yeah, I think that is pretty much true. For instance, there's some small modifications that I think, would be nice to have, like check lock time verify opcode, but certainly nothing that changes the underlying economics of the system, like the blockchain limit changed.
So, Gavin, I'm kind of curious if you have any questions of Peter or any thoughts on basically what he's proposed here, because this is pretty much the opposite of what you've proposed. You've proposed that we modify the blocks and then, we work with that. And if it becomes a problem again, then we might look at it again at that point. Whereas Peter's basically saying predictability of the fact that we're not going to address this actually is the solution to the problem from his perspective. Can you talk about the holes that you see in his argument? Or
Sure. So, Peter, I want to press you on the idea that hub and spoke would fix this. It seems to me if you have a bunch of hubs, then you've just changed the centralization from maybe being some modest centralization on the Bitcoin blockchain to now we have massive centralization in these hubs that are points of control. Could you talk about why you think hubs would be better than a Bitcoin blockchain where maybe most of the nodes are running in data centers as opposed to computers in people's houses?
Quite simply that the hubs in, for instance, the hub and spoke system or the Lightning system, they're not trusted. The worst a hub can do is hold your money for some period of time, and then you're guaranteed to get your money back. And in many cases, you're going to get more money back than you had before. This isn't a particularly dangerous type of centralization.
In my view of the world, right now we have about 6,000 or 7,000 full Bitcoin nodes that are equivalent of hubs, right? They're doing the full validation of the blockchain. Do you imagine that we'll have 6,000 or 7,000 hubs in a hub and spoke model that essentially replaces those, or trying to understand the model here?
I mean, for starters, the thing is we don't actually have 6,000 Bitcoin nodes that are doing full validation in a way that's meaningful. And the problem is Sybil attacks. If you're not the one actually running the node that you're using, you don't actually get any security benefit from it. When you're running, say, an Android Bitcoin client, like any SPV wallet, fundamentally you are trusting miners 100% because your ability to connect to a full node, unless you, for instance, go and select the node yourself and you have a trust relationship with it, it's trivial to Sybil attack them. We've seen this with Chainalysis, for instance, who actually did this attack on the network, and they were in a position where they could have easily gone and changed the rules under you.
I'm trying to understand how the hub network would not have exactly the same issue of a Sybil attack a hub and somehow try to screw up the transaction flow, censor transactions, do all the other bad things you can do if you Sybil it.
Well, again, I mean, with a hub, you get to choose who to trust. And the trust involved is very simple. It's that.
But you just said, we could do the same thing with the Bitcoin network, right? SPV nodes could decide which full nodes to trust. So I'm not seeing how you're helping the problem.
In a hub and spoke model, you can go run hubs, and if a hub decides to do something like, say, start censoring transactions, you'll immediately have market demands for the ones who don't. The resources required to run a hub are such that they can be run anonymously, behind Tor and so on. Anyone can go choose to use them. You can pick what jurisdiction you're in. People who are, say, of a particular community can go choose to go use a hub that serves the need of their particular community. We've seen this in practice with, for instance, the Silk Road, which did act as an off-chain transaction hub. And using better crypto, we can create a system where such hubs cannot run away with people's money. Whereas alternative, for instance, these 6,000 Bitcoin nodes, first of all, we know that the number is going to drop quite a lot with a Bitcoin block size increase. And the second part is we also know that there's very strong interest from governments, regulators, and so on to applying regulation to the underlying Bitcoin blockchain. And you got to think in terms of how do you resist that regulation? If you're in a position where if you want to mine Bitcoins, you have to have a high bandwidth, low latency internet connection. That puts you out in the open. That makes it very difficult to be in a position where you can, remove yourself from the ability to be regulated. In such a scenario, I think it's quite likely we're going to go see blacklists get applied to the Bitcoin protocol. We're going to see funds frozen fundamentally, not in a temporary way like hub and spoke has it worse, but in a fundamental way where your access to money is denied. That's a much worse outcome. Similarly, in terms of rule changes, SPV clients can't detect inflation. They can't detect money being made out of thin air. They have to go trust a full node to do so. And if that full node lies to them, there's nothing they can do about it.
Gavin's made a specific proposal to increase the block size limit to 20 megabytes and is asking people to agree to implement this in the next 2 releases so that it takes effect in the winter of 2016. That is a very specific solution for a very specific size limit that's being proposed with the code changes needed to implement it. Now, at this point in time, there's been this massive debate, and there's a lot of positions that are quite entrenched. Let's play out the scenario. If this change goes ahead and goes into a release of the core software and essentially is put to a consensus vote by miners, merchants, exchanges, etc., some people in the community have said that this would be a fundamental violation of the principles they believe in, and they would not support this change, meaning that they would deliberately remain on the other side of a fork, trying to split Bitcoin into effectively new Bitcoin, which has a larger block size limit, and old Bitcoin, which they would hold steadfast to. Peter, do you see this essentially coming to a head as a consensus battle? How do you see this whole thing playing out?
Well, actually, something I'll point out is that depending on how this is implemented, essentially miners have the ability to prevent this from happening. You actually have to go take steps to go and create a system where there is this fork. The default way this would happen is if miners chose not to implement this, then nothing would happen and the block size would stay the same. Now, if it were done in a way that made this a true fork, I personally, and I think this is true of many of the other developers on the team, we're not interested in a Bitcoin like that. It kind of takes these kind of ways of scaling. So it certainly would be very controversial. And in terms of where mining would go, I think what we would see is a situation where the number of actual independent miners on the fork is quite a bit smaller than the original Bitcoin. And that would, I think, send a market signal to the fact that this new fork is quite a lot less secure, much more centralized than the original Bitcoin implementation. And in the process, it would probably go and, cause enough uncertainty for the Bitcoin value that both sides of the fork wouldn't be worth very much. So there is quite a tremendous risk there. For instance, if you're a merchant on either side and there's uncertainty, the reality is you can't really accept Bitcoins anymore without taking into account the risk that the coins you accept will be worthless in the future when the issue is decided. So this isn't something you do lightly, and this isn't something that I think anyone wants to do if there's controversy. Peter Wool, for instance, has pointed out many times that any change to something like this needs to be done in a way where there is near total consensus, and we just don't have that right now.
So, Peter, I'd like you to help me understand why increasing the block size is just in general something that is dangerous to decentralization. I'm looking at the numbers here, and it seems to me that the difference between 1 megabyte blocks and 20 megabyte blocks on a monthly basis, assuming that all of the blocks are filled, that 1 megabyte blocks are always 1 megabyte and 20 megabyte blocks are always 20 megabytes, you're talking about the difference between about 4,000 megabytes per month for the way we have it now versus about 86,000 per month for what Gavin is proposing. I have a microwave line of sight connection that is slower than the vast majority of connections out there outside of dial-up, and we're about 3 to 4 megabytes down per second, about 2 up. this doesn't seem like something that would prevent me, even with my limited and unstable connection, from participating. So can you explain to me why this is dangerous to decentralization?
So when you're looking at, say, the difference between 1 megabyte and 20 megabyte, the issue is more subtle than it seems. It's not a matter of being able to go just keep up with the blockchain as it's coming down. For instance, if you have, say, a megabyte per second internet connection, it may look like it's easy to download blocks fast enough, but there's more considerations than just downloading the blockchain. As an example, if you're a miner, when somebody else finds a block, the time you're spending downloading that new block and then verifying it and then building on top of it is time that you're not earning money. And that's actually quite significant once propagation gets up to be more than a second or two. And already we're kind of at the point where even with 1 megabyte blocks, your worst case situations on the Bitcoin network are such that miners already do put a fair bit of effort into lowering block latencies. As an example, we have Matt Corallo's high-speed relay network, which many people use. We even have some miners actually skipping the verification process and just mining on top of blockchains that they haven't actually verified, which is very dangerous for the system. And 20 megabyte blocks just make that problem, another order of magnitude worse. For instance, if your internet connection is 1 megabyte per second, which is a fairly fast internet connection, the best you can do is it'll take you 20 seconds to get a new block. And when you look at 20 seconds over the 10 minutes interval, that's a significant revenue decrease, which you can get rid of by just going to the largest pool and this creates very bad incentives, which we're quite worried about.
I guess the question I have on that is, isn't that what we already have? I mean, in a perfect world, I would agree with you, and I would say, yeah, absolutely, we should do everything we can to incentivize the decentralization of mining, and so people would mine as full nodes by themselves, as opposed to doing the kind of join a mining pool and contribute hashing. But again, that's not the world that we live in, so is it different?
I think you're actually asking kind of the wrong question there. The argument shouldn't be, well, we already have this problem, so what's the big deal? The argument really should be, well, hang on, we already have this problem. It's already a significant issue. Why do we want to make it an order of magnitude worse for what's actually not very much gain? What happens next when we get another capacity demand increase, which is easy to happen? It's easy to imagine going from 1 megabyte blocks to 20. You can then get another doubling to 40, to 80, to 100. This is easy to imagine. We haven't actually fixed the problem. We've kicked the can down the road. And because we've created this sort of temporary thing, we disincentivize people to actually fix the issue. And I think that's the worry a lot of people have in this space. That's just one of many issues.
So, Peter, you said that 20 megabyte blocks would be much more profitable for big miners than small miners compared to 1 megabyte blocks. On the risk of putting you on the spot to do some arithmetic on the fly, are we talking 10% more profitable, 5% more profitable, 1% more profitable? And I guess a related question would be, how much would be acceptable in your view? Like, is it okay if they're 1/10 of 1% more profitable? Because obviously, even with 1 megabyte blocks, larger miners would have an advantage.
So again, let's go and create a hypothetical scenario of 1 megabyte per second down. If we have a miner with a 5% profit margin, the shift from a 1 megabyte block to a 20 megabyte block changes your amount lost due to orphans from 0.1% to 3%, which when you have a 5% profit margin, that's 50% less profit versus going to the larger mining pool. That's a huge, huge decrease in profit. If I was in that position, obviously I'd just go and point my hashing power at ghash.io and not point my hashing power at a smaller pool. If it happens to be that ghash.io happens to go and follow, say, BitLicense 2.0's new regime for blacklisted addresses, chances are I'm still going to point my hashing power at the larger regulated pool, even though I could go point at somewhere smaller simply because the difference in profit margin is so big. That's kind of how the numbers work out.
Moving it from 1 to 20 is essentially a 50% reduction in profit margin, or did I misunderstand your answer?
Under that specific scenario, yes. You can come up with other scenarios where it's even higher or it's lower, but in that scenario, that's exactly the numbers you get.
Okay. So one of the questions that I asked you previously that, again, is kind of brought up here is, I think a lot of us would agree. I think many people who believe in kind of the Bitcoin ethos would agree that decentralization is the preferable way to go with this. But again, if it already exists with 1 megabyte blocks and increasing it to 20%, just increases the incentives that we've already seen. I would argue probably 95% of people out there, they are mining with pools because it is not feasible to mine by themselves unless you have a large private operation. Is this really effectively different than what we already have?
Well, keep in mind, I'm not making the argument that mining with pools is itself, the end of Bitcoin. I'm making the argument that if we create strong incentives to only be able to profitably mine at the largest pools out there, we get ourselves in a position where we're not necessarily able to resist regulation like we want to. And this is a dangerous thing. The flip side of it is, what are we actually gaining? Given that, when I go look at the technological solutions available other than a block size limit increase, I just don't see this as a trade-off worth making. Because I know we will still have a functioning Bitcoin where I can make transactions, I can buy things, I can move money around without a block size limit increase. Whereas with one, we get a minor temporary kick the can down the road.
So, Peter, if we could make large blocks propagate across the network as quickly as small blocks, do you agree that that would fix the mining centralization issue? And would you support an increase in the block size if that got fixed?
Well, indeed. I mean, I've been trying to figure out ways to do that myself. So the answer is yes. The other answer is we just don't know how to do that. We have things like your own IBLT proposal, but they rely on miners to cooperate with each other in ways that are often against their best financial interests. And that's simply not an assumption that I feel comfortable making. I know some people are willing to make the assumption that the majority of hashing power is honest and will even act in ways that are against their own financial interest. But I'm personally not willing to have that as a core security assumption of Bitcoin. I assume that people act according to their best financial interests. And, we just know that the solutions we currently know about to make blocks propagate faster simply break down in cases where we assume that people earn the most profit. Quite concretely, the problem there is that if I find a block, I only need to have 30% of the hashing power out on the network to make it most likely that my block will end in the blockchain. So I don't actually have an incentive to go help out the other 60% of hashing power in finding the next block. And if I don't do that, I'll, in the long run, certainly have less competition. And in the short run, I'll go earn more money from fees. Especially in a scenario where block reward has decreased and fees become more important. It's certainly in my interest not to help my competition, to go deliberately sabotage the systems. And we know it's possible, so right now that's just not a solution yet. I hope that changes. The proof's in the pudding, and we just have to come up with better technology first. So my question to you, Gavin, is do you see resistance to regulation being a core part of the value proposition of Bitcoin?
I do see resistance to regulation as being core value proposition for Bitcoin. And part of that, I think, is to try to get as much adoption as possible. Because in a meta sense, I think the more people who are using Bitcoin and are happy with Bitcoin, the more resistant to regulation it is. I think it's silly to think that Bitcoin could remain a small niche product and be really resistant to regulation. I think we find that the things that are most resistant to regulation are things that millions of people all over the world are using and are happy with.
So then I guess my follow-up question to that is these hypothetical, millions, tens of millions of people using Bitcoin, why are they using Bitcoin versus, say, one of the many Fedcoin, if you will, centralized systems that technically can operate just like Bitcoin, have the same user interface, but they do have that central point of control. What's the advantage for them? And who are these people?
It's hard for me to answer that because any system with a central point of control, it depends on who that central controller is. So I think, anybody who's in one particular country If they see the point of control is like the government of some other country, that's a very good reason for them not to use it. And no country in the world has a majority of people. So I think that's a very good reason why kind of any government-controlled currency would not take over. And I think you can make the same argument for if it's a corporation or some set of corporations. If you don't trust those corporations, then you're likely to not want to use whatever solution they have because you will be worried that your transactions will be censored or you'll be cut off for whatever reason. So that's why I think Bitcoin, which is as decentralized as possible, has a really wide appeal.
Do you think there could be a very wide appeal for systems where you are able to go and freely choose who you are trusting for that, one question of, will you be allowed to make a transaction?
I think that's a really good question. I don't know. I'm curious to hear what you think. I mean, certainly in certain communities, I could imagine them deciding within this community, we all mostly trust each other, and therefore will accept some system where we as a community are going to agree on what transactions are okay and what aren't. But then again, the network effect for money is so great. I don't see any of those becoming a global currency, which is really kind of the vision for Bitcoin and the whole reason I think Satoshi started working on this project.
I mean, I guess I asked that in part because, for instance, Jeff Garzik and many others on the core team have talked about a view of Bitcoin as a settlement layer between diverse communities, who may choose to go and trust someone that they're willing to allow to make that decision. So I'll just kind of leave that there.
I think Bitcoin will be used that way. I said before in the first half of this episode that I try to stay completely neutral on what Bitcoin will be used for. I think the more things it's used for, the better. I'd like to make technical decisions where it really doesn't matter what Bitcoin's being used for. And, we'll let people figure out what it's best for and use it for whatever it happens to be best for.
There are clearly two sides of this debate. One side is nothing should be done. One side is something should be done. And the something side currently is being led by Gavin's 20 megabyte block proposals. Is this something that the average user should have an opinion on? Should they care? I mean, we're talking about it on the show because this seems like a kind of critically important, but is there anything that actual normal users can actually do?
Well, I would go point out that the sides aren't necessarily as clear-cut as I think you're trying to go say. I mean, we're looking at a particular proposal by Gavin and Andresen versus, I think, a broader consensus that what needs to be done does not need to be done immediately. I would certainly not call myself a leader of any particular movement of this. I'm just one voice of many. When, for instance, Jeff Garzik posted his views on how we should see Bitcoin as a settlement layer, I mean, I certainly didn't communicate to him before that. He certainly didn't run those views by me. He was completely independent of me. Similarly, Gregory Maxwell, Peter Wool, Vladimir, et cetera, this isn't like a position that's being led. This is, I think, just a consensus that we're seeing among many people with various degrees to which they take that view. It's often been pointed out that nobody is among kind of my side, if you will, of the issue, says that a block size limit is completely out of the question. Rather, it's a rough consensus that the block size limit increase should be the last resort. We should go actually bump up against transaction fee pressure again. We should see alternative solutions being implemented more. It's only after that we're sure we've exhausted those other possibilities that we start looking at block size limit increases.
So was Satoshi wrong, Peter?
Yes, I think he was. And, that's okay. Satoshi created a system, and for us to go look at his forum posts a year or 2 years after the creation of this completely novel system, I think we're reading far too much into the idea that, Satoshi figured it all out originally. The way I see those forum posts is Satoshi was simply making an argument at the time that given what we know, which at the time was very limited, this is one way you could Bitcoin scaling up. He was quite obviously proposing a possibility that we would make a trade-off between centralization and the cost of a transaction. If you brought him into this room today, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he had a completely different opinion. I wouldn't be surprised if he came up with a novel way of organizing the blockchain. And I'm sure I mean, I know as a fact, many people are trying to do that. I personally have my own thoughts on that, which I think goes beyond necessarily what the show is. When we go look at a post 4 years back, of course stuff is going to be wrong. There's all sorts of things that were incomplete with the original design of Bitcoin. That's just kind of how it is. As far as we can tell, come up with the idea of transaction fees till about a month prior to releasing Bitcoin. These days is considered a fundamental reason why the Bitcoin blockchain may be an economically viable thing going into the future. Yet we have evidence that Satoshi didn't even think that through very carefully, the pre-release. So, I wouldn't put too much credence on that. I think we got to focus on the now, what we know, and where we can go forward.
Whether you're a small blockist or a large blockist, or don't have an opinion either way, I think one of the most exciting things about this entire debate is that for many people who wonder how Bitcoin is governed, if it is governed, how consensus works, what power the core developers have or don't have, what power various organizations around the core developers have or don't have, this is a great opportunity to see this process in action. I would encourage any listener who has any interest in Bitcoin, especially if you're interested in this topic, to look into the discussion as it has unfolded. There's a couple of places where this has been playing out. One of them is the Bitcoin development mailing list. And on that mailing list, you will see a series of threads that are now in the hundreds of messages with many of the most influential voices in the space bringing their opinion, and also with some very, very well articulated arguments, some data points, alternatives. I think the outcome of this, whether you are a small blockist or a large blockist, is that there is a very vibrant, very interesting debate happening in Bitcoin that reveals a lot about how consensus works in the real world.
And I would also add to that and point out that potentially one of the key attractions to Bitcoin for some people may be that it does not have a strict governance model. I think we should keep that in mind when we talk about governance in the context of Bitcoin.
Well, Peter and Gavin, thanks very much to both of you. Gavin, you've been with us for almost 2 hours now this morning, so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this issue.
Oh, no worries. It's an important one, so happy to spend the time.
Yeah, thank you. Same thoughts myself.
Thanks for listening to episode 217 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. This episode was sponsored by Shapeshift.io. Content for today's episode was provided by Gavin, Peter, Stephanie, Andreas, and Adam. This episode was edited by Adam B. Levine. Music for this episode was provided by Jared Rubens and General Fuzz. Any questions or comments? Email Adam at letstalkbitcoin.com. Have a good one.